Okay, good morning. Thank you very much. Welcome to the seminar of the COGNiMATH group. Thank you very much for being here in this second season of the seminars. So this day, we are honored to have the participation of Dr. Lindsey Richland from the University of California at Irvine. But before introducing our guests, I want to thank all the support you have given us on these activities. Through these years, we have worked intensely to bring you different activities, the objective of which is to contribute to your education as a psychology professionals. We sincerely hope that we can carry on these activities through the next year. To all my students, thank you very much for your help and all my appreciation and admiration. You know that it couldn't be possible without you. So I think that research is very important, and I think the topic of today is amazing. I have always found it relevant and exciting to do research on mathematical learning, and Lindsey's work in this line of research is extraordinary. It's an honor for us to have her here today. And Lindsey, I thank you infinitely for this opportunity you're giving us today to share your knowledge and experience. My complete admiration for your fantastic career, and I thank you for your kindness. And without further ado, let me introduce our guest with a brief summary of her career. So Dr. Lindsey Richland is a psychologist whose research centers on children's thinking and learning, with a particular focus on learning in the context of mathematics. She's an associate professor of education at the University of California, Irvine, previously at the University of Chicago. Her work received regular federal fundings from the U.S. Institute of Education Science, National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, and the official Naval Research. And she published frequently in both psychological and educational fields. Dr. Richland used a range of methodologies to understand how children develop the capacity and skills for reasoning generally and in mathematics, as well as to discover ways to optimize students' mathematics learning in classroom settings. So, Lindsey, thank you very much for this great opportunity. The stage is all yours. Thank you very much. Welcome to the COGNiMATH group.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited to share some of my work, and I really look forward to questions. And so I don't know if things are coming in the chat. If you can interrupt me to ask questions, I'm happy to do that at any moment, and also at the end. So I look forward to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lindsey. So if you want to share your screen, thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Okay, you can see it?
Yes, perfect.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so my research is really centered on this idea of drawing connections and sort of thinking relationally. I'm a psychologist, and my original sort of research starting point was a cognitive one, which was really about analogy, right? So some of you may be familiar with analogies from things like standardized tests, where you have a relationship between A and B. So A is to B as C is to D. So there's sort of this formalized relationship between these, mother is to, baby as cow is to, and then the child has to find the right word for calf, right? A baby in that category. So this kind of a formal analogy paradigm has been used many, many times because it's highly correlated with broader intelligence measures. It's correlated with, and it's sort of predictive of many strong academic and achievement outcomes. So we have this idea that, sort of centering much of the way we think is this idea of analogy. So drawing on things we know, this kind of representation of A is to B, and trying to understand some new place, some new concept in C is to D. Now, this is very formalized. So what does this really mean if we're thinking about the real world, right? And the idea of doing an analogy is that you look at the relationship between these two relations, right? And you say, oh, these are the same. These are both like baby, something like that. But we can move into the real world to something like science, right? When you're teaching some scientific concept like, the rock cycle, the formation of rocks, or trying to understand how a volcano works, you might give a student a diagram like this one. And even though it looks really different, these two pictures are really representing the same phenomena, right? And what we're asking students to do is to, take what they know, what they see, and draw the relations to this diagram that can more specifically map out these relations. And then we want them to kind of be able to move back and forth between these different representations of the same information. So this is a very common, when you think about it this way, you think, oh gosh, analogy is a very common principle that we tend to use a lot. But drawing on the cognition of it allows us to get some purchase to understand how we might support student thinking even better. So when we're thinking about mathematics, we can think about structured relational reasoning. That's the cognitive term. And I like to think about this as really higher order thinking, right? So some of you may be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, which is this, represented by this triangle in the corner. And Bloom was actually a measurement psychologist at the University of Chicago, and people tend to use his theory a lot. And he described it once as the most used, least read work, in psychology, where, lots of people use it to sort of generally talk about higher order thinking. Bloom's taxonomy is the idea that we want students to not just do this very bottom thing of like remembering information that gets taught, but rather we want them to move higher up in this level. We want them to be able to apply that work. We want them to be able to analyze their thinking in a new area. We want them to evaluate it, create. But you can start to think, about what precisely do those different categories mean? And they're actually really complicated to separate out. And cognitively, is a particular problem analyzing or evaluating, but it always kind of involves understanding as well. So this actually ends up getting tricky. So one of the cognitive ways I think that's very useful to think about higher order thinking is to really think about doing this top thing. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but thinking about this top arrow, right? How do we thinking about higher order thinking as this process of drawing connections across things we know, across things that we don't yet know, trying to understand things in a broader context, which then allows us to make inferences and go beyond the information that's giving, rather than just memorizing all the vocabulary in this diagram. We're able to take this information and move it, to understand the real world, right? To draw new ideas, come up with, generate new hypotheses about how the world might work. All right, so higher order thinking is a goal that, it's kind of easier to know that we all share. Now, what does that mean in mathematics? Because it's sometimes a little bit trickier, but actually mathematics, I argue, is really a system of relationships. It's really a formalization of this process, because always when we're doing math, we're really trying to see relations between problems, between concepts, and between representations. We don't care that you memorize one problem, right? We want you to be able to take what you know, learn how to solve one problem, and then be able to apply it to new problems. Or, something that you've never seen before, you can think through, oh, wait, but I do know this and I do know that. And, sort of the proof process, right? You can pull together your prior knowledge to solve something new. And that's really the core of what mathematicians do when they're doing mathematics. It's sometimes different than what we teach in school, right? Which is memorize this procedure, use it, in these 10 problems. But really, what I would argue is in order to build mathematical thinking, higher order thinking in mathematics, we want to rethink the way we conceptualize mathematics and instead think about it as continually drawing connections, drawing these representations that are connected across, categories of math. So at the simplest level, right, for young children, any equation is really a relationship here, right? Here's an equality relation. And then when you move to something like this, it's, again, an equality relation. You guys are, quite clear about how to recognize the commonality across these two. But actually for young children, this is really complicated. And there's a big literature in mathematics about how children, really get this one on the right wrong on a very reliable basis. And they do a couple of different things. But, this notion of representing mathematics as this, larger set of relations is really a crucial thing. And the errors that kids make really makes it seem like what kids are doing is they're saying on the left, they've learned that, there's the calculation stuff equals answer. And that's kind of like a rather than it seeing this as a relationship, like a balanced relationship between the two, then it's just a kind of a memorized structure, right? So they need to recognize this equivalence relation. So you can think about mathematics as building and continually more complex versions of this kind of comparison. So you can see many different ways that we represent relationships in mathematics. For example, in exponential growth, you can do it with blocks. You can do it on a graph. You can represent it in this symbolic notation. And these different representations all have different things that they bring to the table, right? The ones with the blocks is very clear, visible, but it might lend the student to think that the color matters or that it has to be, three-dimensional. And then, this graph looks very, very different than the objects, but, you can actually capture the same growth relation there, right? And then, of course, the formal notation is much more simplified, doesn't have any of the perceptual similarity. But what we want is for students to be able to recognize all of these differences. And we know that what happens a lot in classrooms is that teachers might do these lovely demonstrations, but students tend to miss recognizing the relations between them. So you do a day that's with playing with manipulatives, and then they kind of forget about that when they're learning how to do calculations with the notation, or they do calculations with the notation, and then when they're asked to graph it, that's a whole different unit. So then they're kind of having to think through, why these are the same, and it's just a really different learning process, right? So we want to think about building mathematics in a way that's really connected across all of these. And then you have representations that look very similar, but in fact they're very different, right? So here, this is a linear relation. We need to have students understand that things, even if they're perceptually similar, that may be misleading. And we know that humans tend to rely on perceptual similarity, particularly when they don't have enough knowledge of an area, and ignore relational similarity until they end up building extra knowledge. So teachers need to do that work for students, right? Really highlighting these similarities and differences, and having students, put things next to each other, do those comparisons. That's how we can really ensure that kids are actually recognizing this higher order thinking opportunities. So we have lots of different ways this can look. It can be graphs, different representations of figures. It can also be comparisons between problems. On the left, this is a study that we did looking at comparisons between permutation and combination problems, which are both, these are, both solved very similarly, but one requires an additional step. So allowing students to recognize these, align them, see them next to each other, turns out to be very powerful. You can also have comparisons between solution strategies to the same problem. And this is something that in the United States, at least, we've been very focused on recently with our new Common Core state standards movement. One of the things that's really been integrated and been pushed is to give students a rich problem, a hard problem, something that, has some meat in it, some complexity, usually a word problem, and then ask students to solve it any way they like. And then students solve it different ways. And then the teacher will go and pick a couple of those solution strategies and put them on the board. So and typically these would be putting on the board solution strategies that the teacher thought were important for some reason. They might be. So in this particular case, this is from a study that I will build on later in this talk, where on the left you see the subtraction strategy. That's actually a misconception. And then the LCM strategy and division strategies are both correct strategies here. So you see this teacher has made all of these visible at the same time. You can see them. So very often a teacher will say, to one student, tell me how you did it. And they might say it out loud. And another student, well, tell me how you did it. And then they say it out loud. But what that makes it difficult for is for any student who's listening to actually remember, what did they say? What were they, was that right? Holding it in your mind is actually quite cognitively intensive. So doing the work of writing it up and keeping them all visible at the same time can be very important. And then you see this teacher with her arms outstretched. So she's doing gesture, right? She's using her hands to draw the kid's attention to compare these two or both correct ways to do it, you notice they look pretty different, but they both actually get the same answer. So she's really drawing, that clear comparison for the students. So we'll talk a little bit more about what kinds of strategies can be important in helping to draw these connections for students. So, I'd argue that analogy is really crucial. One mathematician, famous mathematician, said, good mathematicians see analogies between theorems or theories. The very best ones see analogies between analogies. So you can think about these higher order relations that keep going higher and higher, and so if that makes mathematics more fun, right? It's like problem solving. You're figuring out, relations. Seeing analogies is actually pretty fun. And you're seeing patterns, and so I think this vision of mathematics is why mathematicians love it. And I think because we don't teach most math that way, that might be why a lot of students don't love it, right? Because it's just this process of memorization, which actually is not the way our brains work very well. We're not great at memorizing disconnected information. So we know that at least in the United States, most students don't come away with this kind of relational thinking about math. This was a problem set we gave to students in community college. So in the study, this was, a series of problems. If you look at them, you can think to yourself, 10 times 3, okay, now is there a relation between that answer and 10 times 13? Now, is there a relation between that answer and 20 times 13? And you might have thought that, you guys, many of you are interested in mathematics, so, you might have recognized that relationship. But in fact, at least in the US, most of our students don't see that. They actually they took paper and calculated the answer to each of these problems separately. And so, we sort of don't automatically come into mathematics with this kind of relational attention. So again, this needs to be socialized. It seems like this needs to be something that, maybe teachers can really support students in thinking through. There's also a lot of, not kind of going beyond and trying to understand why things work, but rather, doing things because that's how they were taught, right? So in this case, the same sample of students was asked, why do you put a 0 down there in this form of, multiplication, multi-digit? I really don't know. I don't know why that's done, but that's the way I was taught to do it. And I always just did it like that. I don't know the answer to that though, right? So, these are students who really are just doing things the way they were taught without thinking about the why, without really doing this higher order thinking, about kind of, here, place value, right? Taking what they knew about, smaller problems and understanding what this might mean for multi-digit multiplication. Same thing for here with the, equivalence relation you saw with young kids. You sort of thought that was something that, well, once you get past 3rd grade, you understand what equivalence looks like. But here, I don't have the data, but what you see is students typically, in order to check the answer, they say, oh, you can take this 715 minus 253, to see if you get 462. That's how you can check your answer. And when asked, well, could you subtract 715 minus 462 to see if you get 253? Students said things like, oh, gosh, I don't know. I have to check that, Anyway, so really not understanding, this sort of even addition commutativity principle, right? And, faculty, community college faculty in contrast said things like, I went into math because I didn't have to memorize anything. So this is the more mathematician model, right? This way of looking at math as the system of relations. Okay, so as I said, in the US Common Core, there has been increasing attention to this goal. And so I don't know how familiar you guys are with it. I'm not actually sure what the standards in Mexico look like, but the sort of system of standards. But what we have is a set of curriculum standards, and then also a set of standards for mathematical practice. So these are really about things like problem solving, reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, pattern recognition, making use of structure. So these are goals that are different than just, capturing the curriculum, but rather about socializing modes for doing mathematical thinking. And so this is really exciting to me. I think it's a great opportunity, and it's allowed for more attention and focus on the how and the why of what you're teaching, rather than just ensuring that students get through this very, large sort of sequenced curriculum, where everything is designed as its own separate piece of the serial, curriculum. So this is this opportunity, but we still find it very challenging both to teach and also to assess. And so part of the problem that we've been having is that our assessments don't always capture, whether kids are doing this kind of abstract reasoning and, recognizing patterns. It's hard to know how to operationalize that exactly. So it's a work in progress, but I think it's neat that this is something that people are recognizing as important. Now, one of the ways you can think about doing this is through having mathematical discussions. And there's really lovely work, if this is something that you're interested in, looking at particular practices for mathematical discussions and sort of thinking through how do you lead a conversation with your students in which you can, talk about the concepts and the procedures and have people give explanations that help to really explain how these representations are, should be used together, how they can be connected. So my piece in here is to take some of these ideas and really look hard at, in particular, this mode of doing comparison and contrast, because that is a really rich way of leading these kinds of mathematical discussions. And so, I know, the most sort of formal classroom setting, most classrooms around the world have a teacher at the front, all the students sitting at the desk. But the goal in a discussion, right, is to really have the students actively engaging, not only when they're talking, but also in listening to what all the students are thinking. And it's not just a matter of saying answers, but rather talking through the why and the how, and recognizing these differences in strategies. So by drawing on what we know about relational thinking, we're actually able to capitalize on a large neurological literature too. So I know you guys, some of you are really focused in that area. And so there's a lot of neuroscience research on relational reasoning, higher order relational reasoning. So we know something about what makes things hard, what makes for, where if you have individual differences and sort of either, brain damage. There's research on children with traumatic brain injury or in older adults. So we know something really about where the challenges might lie for typically developing and for atypical populations. And this can really give us some purchase and some ideas in how we best support learning in relational thinking for all students. And of course, we don't have the science to do, neurological work while you're sitting in math class, but we can get some good ideas about what might be happening while we're there. So what we know from that literature is that there are a few things that make relational reasoning hard. So one of them is about having adequate knowledge. If you don't know anything in an area, you're just going to look at what things look like, what problems kind of look like each other, and so, that's something that actually can be a good hook to get you started, but it's not going to get you all the way there in a lot of these math concepts, like you saw with the exponential growth versus a linear diagram or graph. You might get yourself into some errors if you're just looking at what things look like. So as teachers, you have to make sure that students have kind of activated their prior knowledge. They might have a lot of prior knowledge that they don't recognize as relevant for the moment. So, recognizing and bringing out the relevant prior knowledge right before learning something new can be really important. The other big cognitive piece that we want to think about is the role of executive function. And executive function has really a few different parts, and it really has three parts, we think, but I'm going to focus on two. One being the ability to inhibit and modulate one's attention. So you're sort of suppressing your quick impulse to jump in on something and suppressing your, kind of attention to many things in the environment and really controlling your focus during learning. Now, of course, in classrooms, that can be challenging. There's a lot going on. Even on the board, you remember the picture of the board I showed you with the 3 different solution strategies, there's a lot going on there. And so the ability to inhibit attention to sort of the broad range and focus on what's relevant we think is really important. So a lot of the neuroscience research points to inhibitory control and working memory. So working memory is the ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it, do things with it actively at the same time. And this is really crucial, so if you think about taking what you know about one problem and applying it to a new problem, what worked on one problem, you're trying to figure out if that solution strategy can work on a new problem. You have to hold in mind the properties of that previous problem, the properties of the new problem. Think about, draw inferences about how they're related, and then start to do that calculation, right? That's all a lot of work, so cognitive work. So the more that this is kind of possible to overload a student, the more likely they're not going to be successful at doing that, inferencing and alignment. So this is kind of to get you thinking about what working memory taxing looks like. So try to solve this problem. So it's 5 days after the day before yesterday. It's Friday. What day of the week is tomorrow? Okay, so I'm going to give you a second. Right? It's just so frustrating because you can't hold all the pieces in mind at once. We have a limited working memory store. And so, you can just sort of think about that level of taxing while you're sitting in a classroom. Okay, so teachers must engage students in opportunities for drawing comparisons that build on existing knowledge, that make the relational correspondences salient. So we have to have people recognize that they should be looking for relational correspondences, how things relate in this kind of a structured way. And you have to do so without overtaxing attentional control or working memory. Okay, so this is the goal, right? If we want to, draw students' attention to actually successfully drawing connections and making relationships. So basically, I'm going to talk about a few things. I realize I don't have a clock, so I don't want to take too long, but so please stop me if I'm going too long. But what I want to show is some evidence that pedagogical practices to support relational reasoning actually do improve students' mathematical thinking. I want to demonstrate that this kind of learning is cognitively demanding. So EF actually do predict everyday learning gains. And if we have some time, I'm going to talk a little bit about how things that may give you feelings of pressure and anxiety in a classroom may actually lead to differences in learning. And same for things like math anxiety, right? So we have, sort of all these, I'm not going to talk about these things too much, but we have a lot of, and right now with the, pandemic, there are lots of other anxieties and pressures and things that may be actually using those same executive function resources, and thus those can impact learning from these kinds of opportunities for higher order thinking. So that's important to think about to make sure we have equity in the actual learning that can happen in classrooms. Okay. We know broadly that making students draw connections during problems is correlated with high performance in international data sets. So when you look at classrooms around the world, in one close analysis of teachers' pedagogical practices, we found that US teachers made comparisons, but didn't do these sort of extra pedagogical supports that were likely to ensure that they were successful. So from that, we developed, so we looked at these lessons. I don't want to take too much time. Actually, these videos are available online if you look up the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, which is really neat. And actually, there's a new one. OECD just came out with a new international video study of mathematics lessons that includes several countries in Latin America. I actually can't remember if Mexico's in there, but it's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in the international comparison piece. I'm not going to take the time to look at the video, but what I want to show you is that we found certain practices that were common in high achieving countries, and they seem to differentiate some of the ways that teachers were actually doing these kinds of comparisons, like creating opportunities for analogy. And what we found was that, in the US, teachers more often just said the thing that they were trying to compare. They say, you know, oh yeah, this is just like what we did yesterday, you know, but now we're going to do this kind of problems with fractions or something. Whereas in China and Japan, they more often showed, you know, this is what we did before, this is what we're going to do now. And they actually put them on the board and made them visible. And that small difference can be important. You can think about reducing the working memory load, because if they have to remember what they did yesterday in enough detail to really think through how that's the same, you know, except for the fraction piece or whatever the difference is, then, you know, it's likely to be that some of the kids are not going to remember it in full and thus not be able to benefit from that comparison that the teacher made. And that was even more common in Japan, though that wasn't different. And then the second one is keeping the source visible while they do the discussion of the new one. So sometimes they might put up one problem, take it away, and then put up the second problem. And that happened, again, most often in the United States, whereas Japan was the most likely to leave information and leave things on the board the whole time. So they first maybe solve one problem and then leave it up there while they solved a second one. Or they have two students go up to the board and write their different solutions on the board. And then the teacher would do a comparison so you could see them at the same time. And this, again, I think is a really interesting difference that doesn't cost more money, doesn't take more time, right? It's just is a way of thinking through, you know, how to support the cognitive resources of the students while you're leading them through these opportunities for higher order thinking. Another one was spatial alignment. So this meant, you know, when you put things on the board, do you just kind of put them haphazardly, or are they specially aligned so that it's clear that these, you know, the top line is the same in both cases, the middle line is the same, and, you know, and all down. So then you can see like, oh, it's this one line that's different, you know, you have this last line, you actually have to do something different in this kind of a case. And that way it can become a really easy way for students to actually notice the relations between the different representations that they're looking for. Or like, you know, just to go back to that exponential growth and linear relation, you know, you have these right next to each other. It's very obvious that there's a difference, right, in what those lines look like. Comparative gesture. So again, you know, costs no money, but using your hands is a really powerful way to draw connections. And we find that, you know, teachers of all types most often use their hands to say, you know, to point to exactly what they were saying. So they read out, you know, 3 times 3 equals 9, you know, but what was different was when they said, okay, this over here is just like this over here, or, you know, we can use this over here to help us understand why this works over there. And so those kinds of comparative gestures we think can be maybe important in helping students think about these connections. Source familiarity. So this was making sure that the kids were really familiar with the thing that they were comparing to something new. You can see that that was, again, more common in the highest achieving countries, and all of these differences are significant. But it wasn't as it didn't happen all the time. You know, that's because in math, in laboratory studies, you often have very familiar sources compared to new targets. But in a classroom setting, kind of everything's new a lot of the time. A lot of the times they're talking about, you know, comparisons between like this new problem and then, you know, the next new version of that problem. So, you know, it's okay if the student doesn't fully understand the thing that they're comparing. But again, you want to provide them as much support as you can so that it's not all the way, you know, too much for them to handle cognitively. And providing imagery. So things like pictures, you know, animations, if you're using computers. And I think this is an opportunity we have right now, you know, with all the online learning that we're doing, we can kind of create more imagery maybe that really facilitates, again, recognizing these relationships. Okay, so this is, you know, of course, correlational data, right? These are just giving us ideas about what might be some strategies that could be effective. These aren't experimentally tested yet, but, you know, we really do see these patterns that fit very nicely with what we think from the cognitive literature. Just go through that. So, okay. So then what we did is we did some experiments where we videotaped a lesson where we worked with a teacher to do comparisons, to do some kind of higher order thinking opportunities. And we taught those lessons in real classrooms. And then we videotaped them with multiple cameras at the same time so that we could then edit those videos to create matched versions of the videotaped lessons where there might be some key difference between conditions. So, for example, one lesson might have you might see the whole board, which gives you the two things being compared visible at the same time, whereas a different camera angle only showed you the thing that the teacher's talking about right then. So then we could compare. So then we took those videos and gave them to new students, and we could randomly assign them within a classroom. So in the new classroom, we could compare learning for people who got the video where they got to see everything compared to people who got the video where they only got to see one thing at a time. So that's the paradigm I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk is using these kinds of videos and looking at the effects of these different videos on student learning. And the content that we often use is ratio. And I don't know if you can read these, but we got really crazy answers to what is a ratio. These are students who their teachers said had learned about ratio before, but this is one. What's the definition of a ratio? Definition of a ratio is a musical system that people like to listen to music on, right? They say, I don't know, but my guess is it's something in your car. I think it's something like race, like a skin color. I don't know. We got a lot of really crazy things. It's a pasta made in India. Someone says something used for math, okay, that's kind of a step in the right direction. So we use ratio because this is a hard topic. This is a really challenging area. And it's an area that we know teachers tell us they need support in thinking through. How do you build understanding of ratio? And it's a relationship. So it's kind of the perfect area for looking at this. There's, you really can't get away from the notion of relational thinking and ratio. And we compared, so for this first study, we compared, whether you didn't see anything on the board, we kind of zoomed in on the teacher, whether you could see all of these solutions at once, or whether you could see just the one that they were being talked about at a time. And so, what we find is that when you look at learning, the all visible was the best learning. The part that not visible at all, as you can imagine, is they learned less, that required, we thought, a lot of cognitive work. But on the other hand, we actually found that the part visible was the worst. And so that's when we did the one at a time. And that's actually what we find US teachers did the most. So in our study, the way that this particular experiment was set up was we had the teacher say, have a student go through their solution, which actually was a misconception. So we had them go through like, this is how I solved it. And then another student went through and showed how they solved it that was correct. And the teacher then talked about, well, this one doesn't work because it was just subtracting, not recognizing the relational nature of a ratio. And then the teacher explained why the other one was correct. But what we found is that at the end, the students ended up using that first solution that they were described. So this is, again, the exact same audio stream, but just the lesson itself, they could see different things at once. And that seemed to be that in the one where they only saw one at a time, they kind of memorized the first solution that was given. And in the all visible one, they actually did this comparison between the two. So that they actually could see, why one was correct and why one was incorrect. So this turned out to make a really big difference. And so, suggests that the mode of actually presenting those analogs matters for student learning. And when you're leading a discussion, just having kids discuss their solution strategies doesn't seem to be enough. You really want to make them visible so that students can actually, compare and understand how they relate to each other. So what we are, was that this was because it was adding to the demand to then hold those two things in mind, adding to that working memory load, and also having them inhibit that first thing that was taught, and then, say, oh, no, that was wrong. Let's remember this correct one, right? So we did another study where we looked at whether executive function measures predicted whether or not you learned from these things. So whether that was actually why students were getting misconceptions from that one at a time presentation. And so we gave some measures. I will happily talk about them in the discussion at the end if you'd like to know more. And basically what we find is that those with high inhibitory control, got more correct and learned more. Those with lower inhibitory control did, learned less, and they had more of these misconceptions. And the same thing for working memory. So basically what we see here, what this means is that, students who are sitting in the exact same classroom, getting the exact same video, in this case, they were always the same one. So getting the exact same lesson are really going to learn different amounts depending on the executive function that they're bringing into the classroom, unless you provide supports for those resources and do things like make things visible at the same time, use gesture to help them see what's relevant and help them make it easier to discard what's irrelevant. So we really see that comparisons can be powerful, but only if the learner has adequate EF resources. Okay, so the last thing I just want to talk about is how, the situation that you're in, kind of that moment that you're in a lesson might actually change the way your executive function resources are available. If they're doing something else, you're not going to be as available and as present and able to engage in doing the higher order thinking of comparison in a lesson, right? So these, what we looked at here were things like identity pressures. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of stereotype threat, but the idea of stereotype threat is worry that others may have a stereotype about you. So one of the stereotypes is that, girls are not as good at math as men, right? And so one of the classic studies told women and men that they were about to take a test. And they said, on this test, you can see the difference between men and women. Men tend to outperform women on this test. And when they were told that, that's this category on the right where it says gender difference, you see that women performed a lot less well. When they were not told that there was a gender difference on the test, women performed just as well. So even women who might be particularly good and strong at this topic tended to perform less well than they could have. And, we find this for many things in the United States, for race, for gender, for, basically populations who are negatively stereotyped for whatever that topic of ability measure would be. And what's important, I think, is that actually you see the strongest effects of this when there's a high working memory or difficult content being assessed. And we see the strongest effects for people who feel like they're really good at this thing. So they're highly identified. They really feel like, oh, I'm a math person. I'm good at this. And for those with high working memories, actually, you might think that they'd be protected, right? They'd be good anyway, But actually, some studies, not all studies, but some studies show that for those like high working memory content areas, those are the students that actually underperform the most. So it's really, this can be important as far as things like standardized test scores that might be gateways to careers in, STEM, where you have really highly identified high working memory participants. If they're worried about how others might see them on this test and they want to make sure, I don't want to perform like a girl, so they might be extra motivated, but that actually loads working memory like, okay, gotta do well, okay, pay attention, don't mess up. But that kind of loop actually takes up your working memory resources and makes it so that you don't perform as well. So basically what we did a gender threat. We did this with undergraduates, and we see the same thing. So what we found was in learning from a videotape, we see that girls learned less from the same lesson, and that persisted over time when they were told that there was a gender difference on the measure. And this even it stayed there after we told them, actually, just kidding, there's no real gender difference. When we looked at them over time, after the delay, after they'd been told that it wasn't really there, they still learned less, or they still performed less. So this suggests that they really actually learned less from the video. So, this is about gender. You can think about what might be the stereotypes that could be at play in your classrooms. But I think it's a really important piece to consider, sort of like how the situation, how the cognitive load in any given moment might be affecting learning. And right now, I don't have the data to talk about here, and actually we did this with kids too, and we really see the same thing. And what we see, I'll just say this first. What we see is that with kids, the higher executive function kids are the ones who learned less and who show the sort of least performance. And this was a race threat. So we see that, students really seem to be underperforming what they should be doing. And so these kids, would generally these high EF kids would generally outperform the low EF students in learning, but when they're under threat, they really underperform. So evidence that this kind of situational threat can be important in kids as well as adults. And it also seemed to impact these sorts of interest that kids had. So these kids, we asked them how much they enjoyed the lesson. And those who were under threat said they enjoyed it less. We asked them if they wanted to learn more about this topic. They said they did not want to learn more. And we asked them, we said they had free time at the end. And we said, here are some math puzzles if you feel like, solving them. And those under stereotype threat solved less of those math puzzles. So this suggests that, these kinds of situational pressures can change. This kind of stereotype threat can change the learning, can change the connections that they're drawing and their even longer term performance. And it may change how likely they are to want to continue to engage in this content. And so what I was going to say before is that, I'm going to skip that because I have too much. But what I wanted to say before was that this current context of the pandemic is causing a lot of anxiety and situational overload, right? Like pressure and thought for students who are under, worry, who have worries that are going on. And you can consider how that might be impacting them in the same way, right? So this, kind of these threats and sort of having their executive functions partly loaded all the time, thinking about something else, may mean that this is a really crucial time to make sure that through whatever system they're getting their instruction, they're needing, that extra support for comparisons, making things visible, making them, giving them as much time as they need to sort through and see these relations, because you may be really seeing systematic differences between kids who are under more pressure and threat and those who are under less, learning from this particular, from any particular learning opportunity. So, widening gaps that we know are already in our society. I know a lot of people are talking about that, but, I think this provides sort of a really cognitive way of thinking about what that difference might be. And then I'll just say, lastly, we see something similar for math anxiety. And so we see, that this is one area where, you can find when people are worried about how well they do in math, that tends to have this kind of a problem. And we really want to try to protect against increasing, gaps and differences that become integral to how we then lead people on trajectories in STEM. Sorry, I have too much here. I don't want to talk about more of this, and I don't have a way of skipping on my computer. So I'll just then end by acknowledging all the people who work on this. I have so many people who have worked on many of these projects, but thank you for the opportunity to be here. And actually, don't use that email. Sorry, it's my, anyway, you can get my information from Professor Diaz because my email has changed. So I will stop sharing so I can come back.
No, thank you very much, Lindsey. I can share with them your current email and also your webpage in order for them to see your publication and your research. And thank you very much, Lindsey, for this great talk. I'm going to give you some questions that we have here, and also a couple of ones that I have for my own. But Rocio, that is a colleague of mine in the university. I say hello to Rocio. She said, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. My question is, there is research about how different emotions impact math learning?
Is that the question? Or there most of the work has centered on math anxiety. So anxiety about there's sort of two ways of thinking about math anxiety. One is a trait math anxiety. Is this something that persists always? And so some people, when they just think about math, or they're getting change at the supermarket, having to count out that, it's like, whereas for others, it's about state anxiety. And we actually, in my lab, seems like state anxiety seems to be really important, which is about how you're feeling right in the moment of doing the math. And that one we feel, is really tied to the difficulty of the math. So when something's more difficult, it raises your anxiety level, which then not only makes you, what it can do is make you then have this working memory loop, like, oh my God, I'm doing terribly. Oh no, which then does not help in terms of solving the problems. So getting kids aware of that possibility is one step, to helping understand how to, let them move past it. And there have been some strategies for how to get kids to offload their anxiety, which actually we have not found to be very successful. We found there are a lot of them with older adults that have been shown to be helpful. Things like writing down your worries. But we did a study where we had kids write down their worries right before they learned something, and they looked much worse than before. So we think that kind of it made them focus on, and I'm worried about this, and I'm worried about this, and and so I think that can be a powerful technique, but maybe not something you do right before you learn something or right before you do it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lindsey. And I would like to build in this question that Rocio asked. How about here in the pandemic? With here in Mexico, mostly is online teaching now, and the kids have many problems, maybe with the connections, the gap in the economic gap that have so many disparities. So how can this be more effective? The anxiety, depression, and other kind of stuff in this area of the pandemic.
It's so crucial and it's so hard, and it's definitely something that we're all struggling with. I think one of the things that we've been really trying to think hard about is things like mindfulness, right? This is the buzzword everyone's using right now, but I think there's a good reason. Having kids understand how their minds work, how worries can work, how they can stop and focus and not try to just distract themselves, but just to really allow worries to happen, but then say, you're right to be worried. It's hard, but it's okay. You can, now is the time for focus on your math. So let's take a minute, think about it, take a deep breath, and now we're going to think just about math. And so then allowing for this kind of processing. So, these are things like if you're getting your instruction on TV or on a video, or, these are things that maybe you can get some support from, kind of recognizing the moment to sort of try to attend. But the other piece that I think is important, it depends a lot. I know some of the, I don't know what all the resources and opportunities are, but there are some really good online math curricula that are doing a lot of these kinds of comparisons, that are asking kids, showing them two solutions and having them talk about them, or, having them try one way and another, or comparing different representations of the same content. So there are, there are a few that I know of, some that are better than others. But, there are these, curriculum designers, right, who have been doing this for a long time, and they've been really thinking hard about it, where, most classrooms are in the boat of the teacher who's never thought about this, trying to figure out how to teach their kids online in these ways. And a lot of these resources are expensive, but, when done right and when made available, I really, I think that there are good opportunities. I think videos can be really powerful. They need to be short. They need to be, kind of engaging. But, having live video, even if it's recorded, can be a really, useful tool for getting a little bit closer to that classroom, but then making sure that it's about, giving as much working memory support as possible in those lessons is, I think, going to help to at least minimize some of those gaps that you're seeing.
Perfect. Paola is asking, she's a student of mine. She is been working with kids in education, special education. So she's asking if what can we do for motivate the students to the learning of mathematics?
Yeah, I think, in part, everyone always says, talk about all the different careers that require math, right? There are lots of jobs, coming out all over the world that need math, that require this, and really, high paying jobs. But The other piece is, I think, to, you know, kind of let kids in on the fun of it, right? I mean, this idea that, you know, okay, who can figure out the best way, the fastest way to solve it? Okay, you know, and it's not just about like, did you get the right answer? No, try again, you know, but rather, you know, this sort of like, okay, here's a really weird problem. This is going to be kind of hard, you know, talk to your friends, see if you can figure out how to make this work. Or if you're, you know, if you're alone, you know, at home, just try to figure out your solutions. But, you know, in the US, we do a lot of breakout rooms. I know that it sounds like Zoom doesn't work, but, you know, the kids will go in breakout rooms, try to solve a problem, then they come back together and be like, which way did your group do it? Which way did your group do it? Which way's better? You know, oh, did you get different answers? Why would that be? You know, so making it, you know, more of this kind of a fun problem-solving opportunity is very motivating for students. So, yeah. Right.
Perfect. Rocio is just adding that most of the problems that you mentioned for the kids, also some adults, they still have it. So thank you very much for the techniques. Jessie says hi, also from here. And I like to ask 2 questions. How this knowledge, how this learning in mathematics using analogies and this working with these executive functions have some effects on, for example, the learning of science, natural science, or physics, or chemistry? I don't know. How is the impact, or how it affects?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done as much research in the science area. I've done a little bit. I have a couple of students who have done some of these kinds of studies in science, but I think it's very similar. You know, we did one analysis of the same international data set in science, and we found that lessons rated as the most coherent, sort of high, you know, quality lessons tended to have multiple visual representations that were left available for the whole lesson, and they were kind of, you know, they might be like a heart and then a larger representation of the circulatory system. And so then, you know, the teacher would sort of, you know, allow for the student to kind of go back and forth between, you know, these different levels of representation. And so, you know, so I think that kind of a technique is still really powerful. We haven't done as much of the experimental work. We did one interesting study with, and other people have done some of these studies, but for my work, we did this really neat study with middle school students, college students, and teachers. And we asked all of them, do you like to learn from 2 things next to each other, or do you like to learn from, you know, one representation and another? So we asked them about mitosis and meiosis, and then we also did a separate kind of science concept. And basically all of them said, I like to learn from things next to each other. That way I can see, you know, what's similar, what's different. It helps me understand how they relate to each other. But then we asked them, how do you think that a younger person would learn it? So for the teachers, we asked them how students would learn it. For the college students, we asked them how you know, middle school students would do it. For middle school students, we asked them how 5th graders, and all of them said the other people would learn better by having them one at a time. So basically our ideas about teaching seem to be a little different than our ideas about our own learning. And I think that's counterproductive because everyone thought they learned better. And in fact, when we did an experiment, they learned better from having them next to each other. So I think, you know, we have these kinds of maybe misconceptions about how to simplify things for a learner, just like one thing at a time, keep it simple. But actually our brains work better when we're seeing relations, we're combining things, we're integrating, you know. So yeah, I think that, you know, I would love to know more if you guys, you know, follow up and do some more studies like that.
Perfect. Ipatia, she's also a former student of mine. She's asking for some recommendation for teenagers at the time they are study and learn mathematics online. She said that many of the students comment that it's even more complicated taking classes online than in person. So if you have any recommendation.
I mean, you know, my one recommendation, I mean, I think that you know, one of the challenges with learning online is that there's so much to handle. Again, I'm always thinking about cognitive load, right? So when you're doing work online, I mean, I don't know how their classes are organized, but, you know, here, I mean, you might have 6 classes, right? And when you're doing things at home, you have all these little pieces to keep track of. You know, every class has their little assignments, which typically you would just go to your class and you would just do the work there. But now you have to, to know you have to turn in this for this class, this for that class. That organization is challenging, right? And so while you're doing that, then you're like, you're thinking about this whole stuff, this overarching thing. And then while you're focused on your one class, like in math, then you are trying to really get into it and grapple with it, and you don't have a teacher there to ask questions. You don't, and so one way is to try to offload all that extra stuff as much as possible. So helping students get really organized, use written planners, use online planners. How, the best is, to work with schools and teachers, to create online systems that are really straightforward. Google Classroom's pretty good, having its to-do list, or Canvas is a system that, works on the phone that we've been using a lot. I don't know if you guys are using it in Mexico. And that one, it has like a to-do list here, and then each class has their own thing. And so the more that support can be provided to reduce those extra pieces, then you're more likely to at least allow for the resources to focus in your, one content area. And then in the classroom, the more that you can provide something beyond the sort of bare bones content delivery, right? Like, I think the impulse is that at this challenging time, all we want to do is just get the content through. Forget about, like in the US Common Core, forget about the practice standards, just make sure those curriculum standards get met. And I understand the logic to that, but again, just asking kids to just purely memorize this thing, is just not how our minds work very well. And so trying to remember that actually we still need to get people to think about how this relates to their previous understanding, how it builds on their curriculum from before, how it's going to set them up for next year, is just, we can't lose that. It's really important.
Perfect. Jocelyn says, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. And I have a final question for you, and then I wanted to ask you for a final message. I remember a couple of years ago, I read a paper about when they asked for some social or information such as ethical or racial information at the beginning of the test. The ones that was asked that, it was less the performance on the test. So how can we do as a teachers in order to be more inclusive or less gap gender, gap race, or gap social economic status? How can we work in that, the teachers, the principals, all the schools system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's the literature that I'm talking about. And that's when we did it with our fifth graders. That's all we did. We said, we want to know how kids like you learn math. Go ahead and write down your information here. And it asked about race, ethnicity, gender. And that's all we did. We didn't say anything about, like African Americans do worse on this. Like, we just asked, for their race, but that activates your identity, and sort of your the possibility that others are thinking about that aspect of your identity, right? And so I would say, one of the ways that people have really argued to handle this is to let students in on it. So let them know, not right before the test, but, at a school level, providing information that says, everybody be aware, these are things that can be impactful. These can be hurtful, and they can actually, even if you, like, particularly for you guys who are super high achieving, who are most likely to just, do fantastically, this is something that can happen, right? And so to allow students to be aware so they can protect against that kind of an effect. That's something that people have advocated. I have to say, with my working, the written piece, about writing your worries right before, that made it worse for kids. So I think I'm not entirely convinced that getting kids to know that this could happen is like, that might be like the diagnostic, or might be like the threat where you say, you're probably going to do worse on this test. I mean, it has to be done right. So I don't know. I'm not entirely sure about that guidance, but that's what people have recommended. I think a real key is to, do simple things like not putting those kinds of race, ethnicity, gender questions before, put them after the test. In a classroom, doing as much as you can to not signal these as differences. Like, okay, like let's do a girls against boys test, see who's better. I mean, sometimes people will do that as to up the fun, right? But I mean, those kinds of things can actually backfire. Also, just being careful about, where race, ethnicity, is indexed in very subtle ways, but just, really trying to make sure that you're protecting against that, having students viewed in your classroom in certain ways and in certain categories can be harmful in ways that maybe you're trying to be supportive, but that can still really be impactful and hurtful. So yeah, those are kind of the main, yeah, but I mean, it is a challenge. I think awareness for teachers, administrators, all of that is also a really big step, because it's kind of one of those things that goes under the rug, and you see these, these achievement gaps are out there, you see them. And so people think that is meaningful, right? That they're going to be meaningful. But I think the awareness of underperformance is a really crucial one. And I'll just say the last thing, I know we're over time, I think, but, with in gender findings in the US, what we actually see is that girls tend to outperform boys on math grades, but then on standardized tests, if there's a difference, boys outperforming girls. So it's, not a matter of ability necessarily, and really making everyone aware it might not be ability. It might just be that they're not showing you what they know on that test. And I think that can also change the way people view test performance and test results and some of these assessments in favor of something that's more of like a less high risk kind of a measure of achievement.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lindsey. And I would like to ask you for a final message. As we were talking before we start the transmission, most of the students are undergraduate students in psychology. Some of them are master students in education of mathematics and neuropsychology. So they are interested in this area and doing research in learning, in science, in mathematics, in lecture, in literacy. So if you can give us a message for them that they're motivated for this kind of research, what they need to know, the background. Final message, please, Lindsey.
Yeah, so I would just argue, I would try to get you excited. I hope that some of you got the message that drawing connections and thinking about relations is really a crucial piece. I think it's a crucial piece of how we can think about building strong STEM learners and thinkers. I think that's how we build, a generation of really kind of motivated, creative thinkers in these fields. And that's really what we're going for, right? Rather than, kids who have purely memorized a lot of information about these fields. So I love the idea of the, next generation of scholars, taking that up as a goal to sort of shift the way we think about these fields, and then guiding research based on those ideas. So how do we, those of you who are interested in research, I hope that some of you stay in this field. It's such a fun and exciting place to be, because, there are lots of opportunities to make our instructions better, right? We really need that. We have these big gaps, and really trying to, bolster all students' learning. And I hope that I've convinced you guys to think about the roles of anxiety and, pressure and threat and executive function from looking at this from a cognitive perspective. Something that isn't, we talk a lot about these things from a social perspective, but really the cognition maybe gives us some traction in thinking hard about what the solutions could be to ensure that all students are really engaging successfully in learning. And I wish you the best in this time of real challenge and all the students. And so, more creative solutions for how to support students are important. So best of luck, and thank you for your attention and listening.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lindsey. And I hope you have a good time with us here today.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
And thank you very much, Lindsey. And we hope we can establish a collaboration with you in the near future and establish this communication. If you let us, we would like to keep in touch with you. And thank you very much for all the people that are connected today and for all your questions. And I remember you the invitation for next week talk with Dr. Rebecca Merkley about cognitive foundation of early years math developments, insights from research practice partnership on December 9, 11 a.m. also Central Daytime. And thank you very much again, Lindsey. We keep in touch and we don't disconnect. We keep a couple of minutes before we end the transmission. But thank you very much to all. Have a good day. Be safe and keep in touch. Thank you very much. I stay with Lindsey to a couple of minutes. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.